Hello and welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. My name is Alan. With me, as always, is Gareth.
Hello.
Hello. We have a bit of bonus content for you today because we recently looked at ghosts. And Gareth, with your interest in the history side of British sitcom history, you did a bit of a deep dive on the ghosts, like where they come from and kind of the timeline of that whole thing.
Yeah, I did a little bit of historical research, and my worry was that, well, this is interesting, but it's not very funny. so we decided to we sort of cut that out of the main episode. We'll have a chat about it now. So we'll see in half an hour, won't we, if it was funny or not?
Well, hopefully, if it's bonus content, you know.
Yeah, people can't complain, can they?
So let's get into let's create a timeline here. I'm going to write notes as we go along.
You're going to write notes? Well,
I'm going to write notes.
Well, I certainly hope our listeners will be following suit. It might not be funny, but you damn well better learn something.
I think I need an actual linear timeline to kind of visualize this.
Well, let's go back to the beginning, Alan. Let's go back to the beginning, and Robin is our caveman ghost. So how long ago did you think Robin died?
Okay, so that's a good question. When is cavemen?
When is cavemen?
I mean, it's got to be over, what my sort of hominid knowledge, 12,000 years.
Well, you just made that up, didn't you? You just had a complete guess.
No, I'm thinking,
You said hominid knowledge, and that's a really interesting word, because the question is, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this, is Robin Homo sapiens, or is he some other subspecies of hominid? Is he
Homo
Neanderthal?
Yeah. Well, he has got the heavy brow, hasn't he, and all that kind of thing. The sort of classic cartoon caveman look, which I think that comes from Neanderthals, isn't it? When people depict like these things, which I don't know. It's obviously playing into a bit of a stereotype there, which I don't even know if it's all that true. Is it?
Well, it's funny. It's funny because I did a bit of reading about this, and it seems that current thinking on this is different to when I was a kid. I'm 49, so it's 40 years since I was at school and learned about Neanderthal man. And the wisdom then was that Neanderthal man had been completely wiped out by Homo sapiens. But the theory now is with some sort of genetic research that we're actually intermixed. So Neanderthals would have mixed with Homo sapiens, and we are the result. But regardless of that, the timeline is this. The current thinking is that they have what they call the out of Africa theory. So about 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens moved out of Africa. So like in the East African is where they came from. And they just started gradually spreading out. So into the what's now the Middle East, across Asia. Bear in mind, back then there was an ice age. The polar ice caps were a lot more frozen. And so the sea level was lower, so they could walk from Russia to what's now Alaska, the Bering Sea. They could walk that. So that's how, when the Europeans went over there, we met Native Americans. That's how they got there. They walked from Asia.
So could you walk from the continent to Britain?
Yes, you could. Ooh. So for exactly the same reason, sea level was lower, and you could walk across from kind of what's now Denmark, Germany, across to Northern England, which is called...
Nigel Farage won't like that.
It's build a wall. You can't it's called... anyone who's listened to the shipping forecast, there's an area in the North Sea called Dogger Bank. And the name that's given... That was above the water. The name that's given to that is Doggerland. And it was just land. It was just a land bridge. So, yeah, people would have walked, or humans would have walked from what is now Europe to what is now Britain. There's a line in Ghosts where... I can't remember who someone asked Robin, "How did you get here?" And he said, "I walked here." So I think that's what they're sort of alluding to.
Yeah. So what sort of era are we talking about then? Humans coming to Britain?
We don't really know. When that land bridge was inundated by water, they reckon about 6,500 BC. There will have already been people here by then.
So let's say 9,000 BC.
All right.
Okay, so who's next on our chronological timeline?
Next on our timeline is actually not one of our main cast, but the cellar ghosts, the plague ghosts.
Oh.
So they presumably died during the Black Death, which was in the middle of the 1300s.
That's a big jump, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why are you writing it down, Alan?
Because I feel like it will help me have an overall picture.
Okay, all right, fine. Well, again, to our listeners, while Alan writes this down. I can only apologise for the delay in commentary.
I'm doing my timeline. I've already taken up too much space. I can tell I'm not going to have enough room for everything else. I'm only 2 things in.
What do you want to know about the Black Death? Because I have done a lot of research about the Black Death.
So what we know from Ghost is that there is basically a whole village of people who all died together as the plague Ghosts. So this is an interesting thing in terms of ghost lore. Not only did a lot of people die here, but a lot of them became ghosts. So how many plague ghosts do we have? About, I don't know, there must be about 18, 20, something like that.
Oh, I don't think it's that many, is it?
Is it?
Our main cast and a
there's
couple of
6 main
extras. I would
cast.
say it's about 10 or 12.
Okay, fair enough. I'll take that. It seems like there's a big crowd of people down there. But maybe 200 people lived in this village and they all died. And this is who was left. But that still feels like quite a high proportion based on what we kind of know of ghosts around the world in terms of what Alison sees when she goes out into the world. This place isn't full of ghosts, is it? It seems like becoming a ghost is a rare thing.
Maybe this helps us to work out the stats, Alan. Like what percentage of people go straight away and what people leave behind.
So there must have been approximately, 400,000 people in this village.
Oh yeah, at the starting point we are struggling, aren't we?
So the Black Death. My thinking is it wiped out a third of Europe, basically, population.
It's more than that. It's like half. Wow. Estimates range from between 40 and 60%. So let's just think a half. Like that is mind blowing. I think about this quite a lot. This is a bit of a pet subject of mine. If I was going to write a script for a prestige drama for Netflix or something, I think there's something in this. Like, we see these post-apocalyptic dramas where you've got like some plague and there's a handful of survivors and they have to fight it out, or there's zombies or whatever, blah, blah, blah. No, what I want is a drama where 50% of people die. And what happens to society after that? How do people, not just logistically, how do you keep the lights on? How do you keep power stations working? But like, how do people cope with that level of grief? It's I think it's a really great concept.
Have you seen Avengers?
No. You're going to bring that up. Well, I'll tell you what, right? I have seen Avengers. It's not really my thing, but I have seen it because I had a child when it came out, so I watched them with him. But they don't really deal with it. So, in Avengers, it's Thanos, isn't it? He sort of snaps his finger and half the population goes. But we only deal with that from the point of view of our protagonists. Like, we don't see how it affects the wider world. Yeah. That's the bit I'm interested in. Maybe it's a sitcom pitch. Maybe that's a bit dark and it's too dark for sitcom. Actually, I recently watched Upstart Crow, and they had an episode that was made during COVID, which they were sort of, the plague is in town, but it was a bit dire, to be honest.
I know what you mean. Like, I think there is an interesting kind of story there. Like, how does society function if you remove half the people? And obviously, there's unemployment would go down. Opportunities would arise. So it wouldn't be like all doom and gloom. There would be like some.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because in real life, that is what happened. There were 2 really lasting changes that came from that generation or 2 of lost people. One was the birth of English literature, and the second one was workers' rights. So if I talk about literature first, 1350-ish, 1348 was the Black Death. And what we found was a lot of monks died because they were living in close proximity, like they were disproportionately impacted. And so they were the people who were writing. Pretty much everything that was written down by monks. And a lot of them died. And so people started writing in English, in the vernacular language, rather than in Latin. If you ask someone what's the first work of English literature, they'll say Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. That's 1380s. So that's a direct result of this birth of written English.
And then serfdom.
Yeah. So workers' rights, as you just sort of half-jokingly said, if there's not as much labour, and this is an agricultural society, the only thing that you could sell was your labour, and suddenly it's in demand. The plants, the crops still need bringing in at the end of the season, so you can ask for more money. Now, at the time, you couldn't ask for more money because you didn't get paid. You had what you call serfdom, which meant you live on the land, you work the land, and the Lord gives you enough food to keep you alive. And that was it. That was how people lived, and that changed.
All right, let's get away from disease and back to death.
Looking along our timeline here, what I've done is I've arranged all the ghosts and put them in time order. But actually, the next thing on our timeline is not a ghost, but a building. And you've done some research on Button House itself. So tell us about Button House.
Button House, the real building where it was filmed, is called West Horsley Place. It's near Guildford, if you want a bit of a perspective. Without going into like sort of a lot of detail about the building and when things were added to it and all that kind of thing, we know it goes back to the 15th century. Henry VIII sort of owned it officially at some point because they, took someone else's land.
That happened a lot, didn't it? Henry VIII would sort of attainder someone, cast them out, execute them, and just say, "Well, looks like we'll have to take this land."
Ooh, we'll have to take this now. Yeah. But the interesting things that jumped out to me in terms of its history. Well, first of all, I was thinking, okay, this is now used as a filming location, which you'll find for a lot of old country houses and stuff like that. It's a great way to make money. All these big old country houses, they're expensive to keep. You can't just live in them. You actually have to have them open to the public, otherwise, National Trust.
Diversification of revenue, Alan.
That's it. Yeah, because the farming doesn't pay anything anymore. But so in terms of the history of it, what I found fascinating was that this building has a very similar history to the one that we see in Ghosts, the fictional building. Okay. And I'm not sure how direct a kind of connection that is. Like they literally, the people who wrote it, they learned this history and was like, "Oh, that's a good idea."
Oh, so adapted from reality into the
maybe. I don't know. I haven't heard anyone say that, and they seem to be quite candid in their interviews and stuff like that. And I even thought maybe they filmed some horrible histories there. It would be an obvious place to go and film, wouldn't it? But I don't think the timeline quite works out because it wasn't being used as a filming location until relatively recently. So here's a brief history of it. At one point, it was the home of a Conservative MP, like back in sort of 1900. Julian. So that was kind of a little connection there, which we connect to Ghosts. But that was a different time era. But here's the recent history. In 2014, the woman who owned it and lived there, who was 99 years old, she was the Duchess of Roxburgh. She died, aged 99, with no obvious heirs. They had to find out kind of who's the closest relative here. Just as we see in Ghosts. That's how Alison ends up inheriting this place that she's from someone she's never heard of. So here in reality, the Duchess of Roxburgh dies in 2014. So the house goes to a grandnephew, someone she's distantly related to. And that person is Bamber Gascoigne.
Bamber Gascoigne.
Who, if anybody remembers...
He presented the University Challenge. Yeah, that's all I know about him. Actually, here's a question. I know Bamber Gascoigne. Let's make a sitcom connection. He's Bambi in the Young Ones episode Bambi.
That's Griff Rhys-Jones who plays him, isn't it?
All I know about Bamber Gascoigne is that he presented the University Challenge. That can't have been his only job. What was his career?
I think he was a journalist.
Okay.
I think he was.
Well, Jeremy Paxman did it later, didn't he? So yeah,
in that same kind of sense, a sort of a journalist who became an on-screen kind of journalist type character. Yeah. So Bamber Gascoigne sort of goes, all right, let's see what I can do with this, and from what I can tell, basically sold everything, all the stuff, sold all the possessions in order to raise money. And we're talking millions of pounds to help then get the building back up to scratch. And again, it's something we see in Ghosts. This couple who have no capital at all, apart from the building itself, are trying to get it decent enough condition to at least not fall down. That's all they're really going for. That's millions of pounds to make that happen. There's no. If we're getting real about it, there's no value to them owning this house. It's not a good thing for them to have. It's a bit too much of a worker-upper,
Yeah.
But in reality, they raised millions of pounds, and then they got it to a point where they could open it up. And this is what we see in the show. They're opening it up. Okay, you can hire it out for parties. You can do it. You have to go a bit bigger than that. And in this case, they do open up to the public to do tours and things like that. They have weddings there. That's always a big money spinner. And now, obviously, they have filming there, as we can tell. But they have a 700-seat theatre within the grounds. Obviously not in the building itself, but in the grounds of the thing. So diversification of revenue.
And have they exploited the Ghosts thing? Can you do like a Ghosts tour?
Yes. On their website, they have a little tab that is for Ghosts fans, BBC Ghosts fans.
So that's like, we're not going all in, but if that's why you're here, there you go. There's your page.
I haven't committed to doing it yet, but it seems like exactly.
You should. It's down there, your neck of the woods. You should do it. I'm not sure it's worth a drive from Yorkshire to Guildford for, if I'm honest with you, but yeah, you're in London. You should do it.
But £22 it is for the tour.
That's about
I need to. I'll do it in the summer. But they do. I think they do a lot of filming there. So there will be. I think if they do a tour, it will be like, okay, you all know about ghosts, but also, do you know that they filmed so and so here? And this. Remember this scene from this?
Yeah.
So they do a lot of filming there. Yeah.
So you brought us up to date there with the building. Shall we go back into our timeline then?
Yes.
Which do you think is the next ghost along the timeline?
So it'll be Headless Humphrey. Or Mary, the witch.
You're right. Yeah, they are quite close together, but it's Humphrey. It's Humphrey. So in the show, we see the backstory there, where Humphrey has a wife she's French, and there's a whole thing there. There's a whole B plot about Robin learning French from her, and the French Catholic lady is involved in a plot to overthrow / assassinate Elizabeth I, and unfortunately, Humphrey inadvertently, unwittingly gets implicated in this conspiracy, and he ends up accidentally being beheaded and taking the blame for it.
Comedically beheaded.
Yeah, he's hiding in the fireplace, and he sort of sticks his head out. Have they gone? And the swords fall off the wall and chop his head off. But this was interesting, doing a bit of research on conspiracies. So if you think about the Wars of the Roses. And, we look back in history, the Wars of the Roses were in the 15th century, and they ended in 1485 when Battle of Bosworth, Richard III, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, he gets killed, Henry VII takes the throne, and the Tudor dynasty is born, and the rest is history. That's what our perspective tells us. But you always have to remember with history, they didn't know that at the time. So, yes, Henry Tudor is now in charge, but Henry VII, his son Henry VIII, his 3 children all reigned, for over 100 years after that Battle of Bosworth. But they were never all that secure. They were always, the Wars of the Roses went on for a long time, and it all seemed to settle down, then it kicked off again, then it settled down, and it kicked off again. So there was no reason to think it wouldn't kick off again. So the princes in the tower that Richard III apparently had killed. There are a couple of people who turn up, who pretending to be those young princes. There are other noble Plantagenet families who want to take the throne. And then after Henry VIII, those plots start to take on a religious nature. So there's when Mary she's Catholic, and when she's queen, there are Protestant plots. When Elizabeth I is queen, there are Catholic plots. But there are plots. There are plots galore.
Right. So where does Humphrey fall into this?
Well, I did a little bit of research. The one that it seems to resemble the most, something called the Exeter Conspiracy. And this was actually a plot to overthrow Henry VIII. The plot was to overthrow Henry VIII and put his cousin, the Marquis of Exeter, hence the name, on the throne. And there was some French influence because the French wanted an ally on the throne. And it was very much that sort of country house plot. And it was all uncovered, and the poor unfortunate Marquis of Exeter ended up with his head cut off. But it's probably a little bit disingenuous to say, that's what they copied from history, because it's not, it's not like for like. But there were so many of these conspiracies and plots that you can sort of take the flavour of quite a few of them.
So what sort? In terms of our timeline, what are we talking about here?
The 16th century. So it's a plot to overthrow Elizabeth I in our timeline. So she reigned in essentially the second half of the 1500s. So it's that timeline.
Okay, I'm writing this down. Late 1500s for Humphrey. It's interesting, Humphrey as a character does get a bit kind of shortchanged. There's reasons for that. I think...
Well, the main reason is that he's sharing an actor. This is a good question, because I never warmed to Humphrey as a character, because we don't really see enough of him. And I really love Robin, and obviously Lawrence Rickard's playing both of those characters. So I never really warmed to Humphrey in quite the same way. He seems very underserved, and I wonder why they decided to have that second character for Rickard to play. Why not just bring in someone else?
My read on it is that this was a little joke character. Oh, and there's a headless guy, and occasionally his head rolls by and says something.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was set up to be. And then they kind of were like, oh, let's just establish the history of that character. Because he never really becomes a lot more than that.
No, we have that one episode where we get his backstory, and he's the main character in that episode. But yeah, that's not him being heralded into the main cast, is it? He's still a peripheral character after that.
And by having him as a double, as an actor playing two characters there, it means you can never really have him in the main cast because they would have to be on screen together, and that's just a pain. Or too much of a pain to do it on a regular basis. You can have the headless guy, a guy who's 5'3" with a fake shoulders on his head like that. You can do that, and yeah, I think it's just a bit of a joke character that they're then lumbered with like for the rest of the show.
Yeah, you've made your bed.
It's a good idea on paper.
Yeah,
but also it's not just like, oh well, we need this actor to play two parts. It's like this actor who probably spends 3 hours in makeup every morning just to get into Robin.
Yeah, now we need you to So we move forward a couple of decades to Mary. So Mary's the witch. Mary is burned at the stake as a witch, and I think we talked about this a little bit in our main podcast. She's the only one who really displays what might be reasonable for all of them. She has post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, she is really traumatized by her death. Quite understandably. She was burned alive by her villagers, by the people that she knew. Yeah. Which is quite harrowing. Not ideal for a sitcom. Yeah, we see her backstory. We see a couple of peasants, farmers, and their crop is not very good. And they're like, oh, God, we're going to be in trouble here. And then they see Mary sort of singing to herself. Oh, she looks a bit odd. And they, that's it. We don't see the rest of the tawdry witch trial. All we see is, oh, yeah, she could take the blame for these crops dying.
Yeah, and she's already, even in life, very kind of soft-spoken and shy and oppressed, probably.
But that's interesting because, generally speaking, if you look back at witch trials, and I am massively generalising here, it seemed to be, more often than not, a way to shut up a mouthy woman. And so Mary's not that. Mary's the opposite of that. She's a sort of quiet, mousy woman. But the witch trials ran in this country for a long time. They ran sort of from the 15th to the 18th century. We talked about this quite a bit. Was it when we did the Blackadder? Or did we talk about this?
Yes, Witch Smeller Pursuivant, yeah.
But yeah, there was a big uplift in the early 1600s. So when Elizabeth I died, James I and VI became king. He was Scottish. He came down and ruled England and Scotland. And, well, not to put too fine a point on it, he was really big on this witch shit. Like, it was his thing. He was into mysticism, and he believed in magic, and he believed that there were dark spirits and dark forces and all that sort of thing. There's actually a book that he wrote about witches. He popularized it in a way that gave it all an air of legitimacy.
But how does that all come to an end then? Like, what was witchcraft a fad?
Well, like I said, that's the early 1600s, and then the Civil War was the 1640s. Cromwell era was the 1650s, and it was a lot of women were being accused and tried and killed throughout that whole century, and it still dragged on quite a while even after the restoration of the monarchy. Basically, it comes to an end in Britain in 1735. It's that late. There's what's called the Witchcraft Act of 1735, which is a law passed in Parliament. And that ended... Well, actually, it did more than just end in witch trials. It sort of flipped it on its head completely. It made it illegal to accuse someone of being a witch.
Is that like saying, look, witchcraft is not a thing, so stop doing it, or stop accusing people of it? Or is it saying... Yeah. Okay, witchcraft could possibly be a thing, but let's stop killing people.
No, it's not that. It's the first thing, Alan. It's very much, this is bullshit, pack it in. Oh, that's very much the tone of it. It is now illegal to accuse someone of being a witch.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that seems very progressive. Okay, so we have Mary here, and we know from her little backstory episode that she, even when she's a ghost, she's just scared. She doesn't know what she's doing, what's going on. There's a headless ghost, talks to her occasionally, and she runs off. There's a caveman running around, sometimes interacts with him, until she finds her voice because of Annie. We sort of get Annie introduced sort of later on. So what's the gap there? How long is Mary knocking about?
It's about 100 years.
The world go by?
It's about 100 years. So Annie dies in the early 1700s. Okay. I think on the first day she moves in, we sort of see they seem to be moving into the house, and she chokes on a bit of bread. Annie, played by Bridget Christie. She's only in 2 episodes, but it is one of my favourite guest appearances. I think she's brilliant. But it was interesting because if you look at, if you look at that family, Annie and her husband, you think Puritans, right?
Yes.
That's kind of how they present. But this is a bit late for Puritans. So in the early 18th century, the 1700s, this is a bit late for Puritanism, really. But they're probably some sort of non-conformists. So now you've got a little bit of religious toleration. Now we're all Protestants. So there's no Catholic Church saying this is the way it must be done. So you get these non-conformist groups like Methodists, Quakers, those sorts of groups, who were still, they were tolerated. That's the word. So it wasn't illegal to be a Quaker or a Methodist, but it was still quite a risky business. And if you started saying heretical things, you could end up in trouble.
And, you're talking about witchcraft and mouthy women and all that sort of thing. Well, Annie is that, isn't she? She's
furious.
She's railing against the oppression of women. And death gives her free license to say what she wants to.
I love her first words when she realizes she's dead and that she's a ghost.
Be this a joke? Why am I not in heaven? What, because of the bread? I have lived a lifetime abstaining from all pleasures, listening to his verbal effluence all the day long. Could not so much as cough without furious consequence. And by what? I was promised Eden.
She's absolutely furious. She's put up with this crap husband for all these years, and she's not in heaven. She's fuming.
Yeah, and so Annie and Mary become friends, and Annie helps Mary, sort of find her voice is what they believe they call it in the show. But enabling her to kind of speak up and say what she feels, which even Mary, this is 4 series in by this point, but Mary as a character, as we've established, is still quite timid and a little bit hesitant. But this is the improved Mary.
Sure, like we see before Mary. Before Annie comes along, we see her, she's sort of like a frightened cat, isn't she? She hides in the corner and runs away.
Yeah.
Which, I guess, if everyone you've ever known in your entire life has tied you to a stick and set fire to you, you can understand that.
Let's get back into the timeline. So
we're in the 18th century now. We're in the 1700s. We're past these nonconformists. Which one's next?
Kitty.
Yes. So Kitty dies towards the end of the 1700s, and we have a whole episode where we see Kitty's death. But she dies on Pineapple Day. Do you remember Pineapple Day?
Yeah, so I know there was a time when pineapple's obviously an exotic fruit from the New World, and so were very rare in Britain, and therefore very expensive, and and a status symbol. So if you're rich and you throw a party, you have a pineapple there, so you can marvel at it.
People would come from miles around to look at the pineapple. It was called the status pineapple.
And it sort of found itself into a lot of, you'll see it on like fence posts and stuff, like a kind of pineapple motif. It just became a symbol of
You absolutely
quality.
do. If you go to some of these houses, and I can't speak for Button House, but if you go to some of these old houses where they've got the original furniture, you'll see carved wooden pineapple shapes, on chair armrests and things. It's a motif that recurs, even in architecture. In fact, here's where a very visible pineapple that I bet you've seen 1,000 times but not realised. At the top of St. Paul's, there's a gold pineapple.
Oh, really?
So Christopher Wren designed that after the Great Fire of London. What's that? 1666, I think.
Yeah.
There's a dirty great pineapple on top of St. Paul's. Look, Google it.
Interesting.
Well, when I was doing this research on the status pineapple, it was quite interesting that, like, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, those early Americans, they were all big into pineapples as well. And obviously it wasn't quite as expensive to get one to the east coast of the USA as it was to get them to Europe, but they still had that same status, that same cachet even there.
Yeah. Fancy fruits.
Fancy fruits. Speaking of fancy fruits, shall we talk about Thomas?
What a wonderful
You're
segue
welcome.
that was.
I'm going to be straight with you. I'm pretty happy with that.
Okay, so Thomas Thorne is our next character.
Thomas Thorne is our romantic poet. So the early 1800s. I am dating this he was a contemporary of Lord Byron, and he mentions Byron a lot.
Isn't it his sworn enemy?
Yeah, and Byron died in 1824. He was born in 1788, so he was an adult in the early 1800s and died in 1824. The joke is that obviously Thomas Thorne is a terrible poet. You know, we see him waxing lyrical about Alison. We see him in flashbacks doing a poetry recital the day of his death, and he is a terrible, terrible poet. And one of his absolute hate figure is Byron, who he regards as inferior and a terrible, terrible poet. And I suppose that's supposed to be a joke, but I think he's right. I find Byron utterly insufferable.
Is that just poetry or Byron specifically?
I'm not a poetry guy. Like I'm not, I'm relatively well read. I'm a relatively intelligent man. I just can't do poetry. I've tried. It's just not my thing. Unless it's a limerick, it doesn't work for me.
So, in terms of Thomas Thorne, if we're putting him around the same kind of time period, that's early 1800s we're talking.
Yeah,
right?
1820, that sort of time, yeah.
Put this into a context I understand. Where is this in relation to Blackadder?
Well, we are actually roundabout.
The Prince Regent, right?
Yeah, we're round about Blackadder 3, yeah.
Let's just jump to Blackadder for a bit. Because my knowledge of this here is, George III was mad, and so was incapacitated a lot of the time, and so his son,
the Regent,
who was Prince Regent, kind of ruled everything, and it was the Regency period. Now, in terms of Blackadder, that character is portrayed as a sort of foppish idiot.
Yeah.
But in reality, he was a sort of solid leader, but also just liked the ladies and was debauched and hedonistic, right?
Yeah, he was by the time he wasn't very old when he died. He wasn't actually king for all that long before he died, but he was like well overweight, and he was sort of dissolute and riddled with gout, and just he just had a very hedonistic lifestyle. But he wasn't, he wasn't the idiot that Hugh Laurie plays,
So what we're saying is Blackadder less historically accurate than Ghosts.
Do you know what? I'm prepared to say that. Yes, correct.
We're happy with that. Yeah, okay.
Correct. Yeah. Can I talk a little bit more about Byron, because he really wound me up learning about him.
Okay, go on.
So here's a quote. I'm going to give you a quote. No, I'm going to give you a reading. Ready?
Yeah.
There are 4 questions of value in life. What is sacred? Of what is the spirit made? What is worth living for? And what is worth dying for? The answer to each is same. Only love.
Ugh.
Until you get pregnant, love, then you're on your own. This guy squandered his family fortune. He left pregnant women behind him all over the place. He fled to France at least twice because he'd got someone up the duff and wanted to run away. So what he did was he went off and fought in the Greek Civil War. That's quite a handbrake turn, isn't it?
Well, you could do that back then, couldn't you? You could be a romantic poet and fight a duel.
Renaissance man.
Yeah, but that's what Thomas Thorne is, isn't he? He will put his life.
Well, he's
on the
not,
line
is he? Despite my opinion, Byron was a romantic hero, put his money where his mouth is. Went and fought in a war, and Thomas got shot in a duel. First time he'd held a gun.
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because Thomas, he did. That's his romantic ideal of what it is to be a romantic poet. I have fallen in love, therefore I should die for love. I should kill for love. I set eyes on you once, and give me a bonus, so I am now in love for the rest of eternity.
Yeah.
But that's because of his romantic ideals, which are probably nonsense. But he certainly lives by them. What about dueling? When did dueling stop being a thing?
Well, it was always illegal.
Was it? Say you're the man who kills Thomas Thorne on the gardens.
That's murder. That's murder, mate, with lots of witnesses. You're in trouble. It was always illegal.
That's why the duels always kind of took place, at dawn on a heath somewhere.
Exactly.
With just a couple of seconds as witnesses. But everyone just keeps quiet about it.
Well, I think so, yeah. That's kind of what happened. Let's move forward a century. So we're in the early 1800s, and we need to move forward to the early 1900s for our next character.
Okay. Which must be Fanny Button.
Fanny Button.
Which is a hilarious name.
Oh, Fanny.
So, yes, we have a character called Fanny, which wasn't funny in the early 1900s. People didn't realise that was a joke. When did people start calling vaginas fannies? Where did that come from?
I don't know. I did actually try to find this out, and I couldn't get a sort of definitive answer as to when did we start using fanny as a euphemism. But then the other interesting thing that we all know is, of course, in America, fanny means backside. So
means your arse, not your minge.
Not your minge. Another sitcom link. Well done. We are making this sitcom related. I hope our listeners are pleased. But no, I don't know. But what I did find out in my research, which is quite interesting, is that in New Zealand, it is illegal to call a child fanny. So in New Zealand, they must have I'm not sure they've got a list of acceptable names, but they have got a list of unacceptable names. So I guess you can't call your child bullshit and you can't call your child fanny.
That seems very harsh when it is a name first. So what do we know about Lady Button? The house is called Button House, but it's not. But that comes from her lineage. We don't get solid information about when the house is built in terms of the show. Let's assume it's similar to
well, we know
reality.
It's before Sir Humphrey, don't we? So it's been around a long time.
Well, arguably that could be a different house that was knocked down and replaced. Possibly. I guess. I don't know if that's really. But yeah, Button House. So Lady Fanny Button is of the Button lineage, but also she is married. So
I couldn't work.
She's married into the Buttons. Is it? Is that?
Yeah, maybe it's not her. Maybe she's married in. You know, we know that she regards Alison as her offspring, which she is. She's part of the same family, but maybe she married into that family. What we know about Fanny is that her husband was homosexual, hence the sterile, frigid relationship. And we know that she caught her husband, Pon the gardener, hence the cold-blooded murder.
It was my husband, George. I caught him, Pon, the groundskeeper.
Good Lord.
With the butler on him. Like a sandwich.
A manwich.
Actually known as a Moroccan tea party.
Guys. Clearly he didn't trust me with his sordid little secrets, so he just did away with me.
Yeah, so he kills her because she's found out his terrible secret. Is the basic
pushes her out the window when she's walked in on him.
I mean, well, let's deal with a bit of homosexuality. Our next character on the timeline is the captain.
Yeah. So 1944, we see him die at that military conference. The captain, he has a heart attack and he dies, and he gets to say "I love you" to the man that he's, what should we say, that he's had a crush on. That feels a little bit dismissive. He's in love with.
Certainly, it's interesting how much we see of that. It's not just, oh God, I'm obsessed with this guy. There certainly seems to be enough coming from the other way to make it feel like an unrequited or unspoken kind of love situation, as opposed to just, oh, I fancy that bloke over there.
Yeah.
But obviously neither can acknowledge it, and so it is completely.
But beautiful. That's a really beautiful moment at the end. The captain's death. It's really well, he's dead, but it's a really nice moment. But interestingly, I was in the army in 1994. You could still get chucked out for being gay. You could still get thrown out of the army when I was 19. But in 1944, you'd be thrown in jail, so that was not spoken of. Mm. What about this concept of stolen valor? So he steals someone else's jacket to get into that meeting, and that jacket has got all these medals on. So in the afterlife, the captain's wearing all these medals, but he didn't earn those medals. He wasn't on the front line. He was in a support role in Button House.
He was in Button House?
Yeah.
Well, I know, for example, I've been up to Bletchley Park where they did that. They took over the whole place to do code breaking and all that sort of thing, which obviously was a secret at the time. Is that kind of what's going on here? They've just sort of taken up this big country house to house men because they're training them there, right?
They did it a lot. They use these places. Bletchley Park's a great example. I went to, when I was in the army, I went to a place called Welbeck College. And it was called Welbeck College because it was in Welbeck Abbey. And this was the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Portland. And whoever the Duke was in 1939 said, you can use my house to house military cadets. And that's what it was used for during the war. It was used as a training centre. And then he signed over a 50-year lease. So for the following 50 years, it was used for military cadets. And that's why I was there.
Were they getting a little bit of a touch off the government to use their buildings? Probably they were getting paid from rent. Yeah, I would imagine so. I'm not sure. I don't think it's quite so cynical as a big money making exercise, but I don't think they would have been out of pocket. That's for sure. I think I can be quite cynical about landowners. I'm all right with that.
Yeah. So here's a question. This idea of stolen valour. So the captain's wearing those medals he hasn't earned, damn it. Because he was in a support role and he served out the war in England. And I wondered, how common was that? How many people actually sort of fought on the front lines and how many people were doing other things, planning and driving and cooking and Ensa?
Yeah. Well, I've been watching Are You Being Served recently. A little sneak preview of what we may be looking at in the future. Yes. But the captain in that, Captain Peacock, who is now a floor walker at Grace Brothers, he's very much like I served in the war for you kind of vibe. This is 1970, mid-70s, kind of the prime era of Are You Being Served. And a regular kind of joke is that he worked in the cookhouse or whatever. Like he worked in distribution of catering and stuff like that. And he sort of rails against that he didn't, and actually...
But that's an important job.
Exactly.
I think this is fascinating. So the captain was sort of, in that scene, he's looked down upon because you don't belong in this room because you're not a proper soldier. That's not the words they use, but that's the implication. But he was a proper soldier. Like, he was doing important work. He was away from his family and he was serving his country. And not everybody is, fixed bayonets stabbing the Nazis.
But that's it. If you're unlikely to get shot at some point, then it's just not as heroic, is it?
I think it's interesting that distinction in 1944 or 1974 would have been very different to this distinction now. Or maybe even 10 years ago when there were still some people left alive from the Second World War. Oh, you served in the Second World War. That's all you need to know. It doesn't. We're not saying, well, hang on a minute. When you say you served, what did you actually do? But I think in 1975, you were asking Captain Peacock that question. I've got some numbers for you. Stats.
Oh yeah.
In the Second World War, 5.9 million people served in the British Armed Forces. That's not the Empire. Wow. That's just Britain. The population was about 48 million then, so it's well over 10% of the population served in the Army, Navy, Air Force, or the Women's Royal Auxiliary Service. So that's a hell of a lot of people. And I tried to find out how many of those people would have served on the front line. And it kind of depends on your definition of front line, but it's about 40%. So more than half of the people didn't.
That's a lot, though, isn't it? It's quite a lot in terms of like boots on the ground kind of.
Well, again, it sort of depends on your definition. So, for example, if you were in the Royal Navy on a boat, they consider that the front line because you could get sunk by a submarine, which I think is perfectly reasonable. I'm not arguing the point. But yeah, that's a hell of a lot of people. I mean, well, I'll do the maths for you. That is just over 3 million people who served in the armed forces but not on the front line. That's not shameful. That's serving your country. Let's lighten the mood and talk about Pat getting shot in the neck.
Okay, yeah.
And people say health and safety's gone too far.
So Pat is our next death, and this is the 80s. So Pat is a scout leader. He's a sort of we talked about this in our episode. He's a pretty typical, father, middle-aged man, we call him. He's about 40, I guess. But yeah, he's a working man. Like, you told me what he does for a living. What was it?
He's a bank manager.
A bank manager, a classic sitcom job. He's a sort of Arthur Mannering type.
It's boring. It's boring. Bank manager in sitcoms, code's boring.
It did back in the day. I mean, I think there's something about a bank manager. It's not just boring. It's officious. It's like you're the big fish in a small pond. That's certainly what we get from Mannering.
Yes.
We watched Desmond's recently, and Michael, the son there, is the assistant bank manager, much to his chagrin, and then he becomes a manager later on, and it's the pinnacle. It's like the ultimate. Like this is his career goals, and it's his way of escaping his working class roots in a lot of ways. I don't think we get that from Pat.
Because Pat's a scoutmaster. That's his identity. Bank manager is just a job he does 9 to 5. He's a scoutmaster. That's what he loves. That is absolutely who he is.
Yeah, and he clearly loves that. He likes teaching the youngsters how to tie knots and all that kind of stuff, and he teaches them archery. Unfortunately, he was slightly distracted one day and didn't give them the proper safety.
Well, do you know what? I made that joke about health and safety going too far, but like we do complain a lot, bloody health and safety. But like this would not happen in 2025. This absolutely would not happen. There would be procedures in place. You'd have had to fill forms in. They'd have all had to sign a form. It would not happen.
I don't believe for a second that a scoutmaster can just go and teach archery. You would have to have an archery licensed.
You'd have to have more than a badge stitched onto your sleeve, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So, A bit of red tape is no bad thing.
So in terms of the context of the show, they've gone to this country house to do a bit of archery, and they've got a bus. So they've driven there, but they're from Wigan. Where are they from?
This is a square I never managed to circle. So you said that the real Button House is near Guildford. Is that where it is? Do we ever know where it is in the show?
That really nailed down, but it's not. It doesn't feel like it's in Yorkshire. Pat is Yorkshire, right?
Pat's definitely from Yorkshire.
Right, because Jim Howick I think he's Lancaster way, I think.
Yeah, but he's definitely doing the Yorkshire accent.
He's doing the Yorkshire accent here, right? But yeah, okay, in terms of the reality of the world, they've gone on a scout camp here, right? And I think that makes sense in terms, again, like what do you use your big country house and its land for? Yeah, let some scouts camp on there. You probably get paid a little bit for that.
Yeah, diversification of revenue. So thinking back to our first episode, the old lady Button who dies in that first episode, she's a really old lady.
Yeah.
1984, that's 40 years earlier. Would she have already been there? She would, wouldn't she?
Yes, but she may have been a bit more active, not stuck in the house. She might have been out and about doing some philanthropic work.
Philanthropic work like opening up the house to scouts.
Yeah.
Don't worry about the paperwork. You just get on with the archery.
And they never had any scouts there again.
So there's a question: did Pat and her meet before he was dead?
Yeah, interesting.
It's interesting that we get these the Pat and Julian. We'll get to Julian in a minute, who are more modern, as in within all of our living memory.
Yeah,
it does throw up. We see Pat's family coming and visiting the house, and it does throw up that there's a different approach. There's a different opportunity for writing there that the other ghosts don't present.
So just to make a very small jump ahead now, and we go to 1993.
Yep.
There's a John Major government. The Conservatives are in power, and they hire a country house for a bit of a jolly.
Well,
and Julian Fawcett MP attends, has a little bit too much, champagne, nose candy, whatever it is, and has a heart attack, we presume. I don't think we ever get
a definitive, nor do we know if he's got pants on underneath that shirt.
Is he actually in flagrante at the time, or is he just...
Well, I don't think it's ever really quite defined. It's a bit dark for a family sitcom.
But it is supposed to imply a bit of a sex scandal, isn't it?
Exactly. And there's an episode where he goggles himself. He gets Alison to look up his name on Goggle, and he discovers that he's remembered not for this treaty that he helped to negotiate, but for dying in this embarrassing way.
Yes, which I'm not sure how much we talked about this in our episode, but it was sort of the sex scandals of the Tory MPs.
Well, the early 90s, yeah.
This
So we said, didn't we, that Julian, or rather Simon Farnaby, the actor, is very much doing a Tony Blair impression, and he's doing a good one. But that sex scandal MP is very much early 90s. So John Major became Prime Minister in 1990. After Margaret Thatcher was deposed. And he won the election in 92, and he went on till 97 when he was beaten by Blair. So that period, 1990 to 97, John Major came out and he talked about back to basics. You remember back to basics? Mm-hmm. And this was, just about having a decent morality and running things in that old-fashioned, small C conservative way. And of course, as soon as he said that, it was open season for all the newspapers to try and find out every hidden scandal that every Tory MP had. And, if you've got 350, 400 Tory MPs, it's not going to be that hard to find a couple of them with scandals.
When did it come out about John Major and Edwina Currie?
Yeah, that's good. That was much later, actually. Nobody knew about that at the time. It was Edwina Currie's memoir, 15 or 20 years later. It was a massive shock. I was shocked to the core by that. It was so out of character, like not for her particularly, but for John Major, because he'd stood up and done this whole back to basics thing and then been let down by all these Tory MPs. And he was at it as well. Who would have thought it? There was a few scandals. Alan Clark, if you've not heard of Alan Clark, he was a diarist. It's definitely if you're interested in dark underbelly of politics, Alan Clark's diaries are great. He was up to all sorts of shenanigans. Most famously, he had a romantic relationships, as the tabloids say, with a mother and a daughter. I'm not going to say at the same time, as in at the same time, but certainly contemporarily. So he was a bit of a hound. There was probably the most famous one, which is not really easy to get any comedy out of this. A guy called Stephen Milligan, who was basically he died in an auto asphyxiation accident. You know, he was basically found hanging, dead. He had stockings on. He had an orange in his mouth, which, as you can imagine, like what the tabloids made of that. This poor guy, he was like a successful journalist for decades. He'd become an MP, and then that's all he's remembered for. And that's what Julian is. You know, he'd had this great career, and all he's remembered for is this. Obviously, they don't. You know, this is a family sitcom. They're just going to have him with no trousers. They're not going to talk about an asphyxie wank incident, but it's
toned it down a bit.
Yeah, but it's that's it. That's what Julian is.
The Julian character is a bit oddly placed because he is this sort of Tory MP, but he's got the real spin doctor New Labour vibe.
He's very New Labour.
But it's interesting that we kind of immediately pick up on that and go, oh, that's just a little bit out of place, but okay, fair enough. Whereas there's probably something about, you know, Kitty that is just like, hang on, that's much more 1670 than 1770. That's ridiculous if you're a historical expert. You know?
Yeah.
But, you know, the one thing we say about ghosts is that they really... And this comes from Horrible Histories, I think.
Yeah.
Historical accuracy was important. I'm not saying
not
it
too
overcuts everything else, but it's important. And
there's enough research there to give it credibility, but they wear it lightly and they're not too strict. I think it's quite interesting how the characters speak, as in Mary speaks like someone from her era, whereas Humphrey doesn't. There's no consistency there, you know.
Yeah, they're not, I guess, not speaking Old English. The plague ghosts certainly aren't speaking like, your Chaucer's English.
No, exactly.
But there's only so much you can do within a.
No, but I'm all right with it. It's not a criticism. I think you've got that. Like I say, you've got enough there to give it some credibility, but they're happy to play around with it and to flex it and not be too strict about things. And I think it works really well. So here's a question for you. We've gone through all of those eras. That's been like I was going to say a whistle-stop tour of British history, but it's not really whistle-stop. We've talked for about an hour. What's missing? You know, if you were able to add a ghost to the ensemble, who would it be? What character? What era? What character?
If we're looking at it as a timeline like this, the big gap here is between Robin and everyone else. There's a huge gap.
Yeah.
And it seems to me an obvious hole in there is perhaps a Roman.
A Roman, yeah. I thought something similar, but not a bit later, perhaps a Saxon or a Norman, or like a crusading knight just back from crusade. But the character is like a warrior, you know, a soldier, but not like the captain, an actual, you know, bloodthirsty warrior. Although I must confess, I sort of wrote this down and I was thinking about it later, and I thought, am I being influenced by the American version? There's a Viking in that. Yeah. And so perhaps that was in the back of my mind when I was having this think. What about either someone from the Civil War, like a Roundhead from the Civil War, bit of a Puritan but a bit of a commie, you know, who put you in charge, that sort of thing. Or then I thought a similar type character from the Industrial Revolution, a sort of up the workers type of character.
Yeah, I like it. I'll tell you what though, if we want to actually get real about this in terms of casting a show, we need another woman.
Yeah, that's true.
Which, you know, obviously historical data, because so much of history is sort of men were in charge, you know, the strong men history, as they call it. That's the tales we get told. But remember, when we talked about the original Horrible Histories team, who was part of that original cast who went on to do something else?
Sarah Hadland.
Sarah Hadland. So could you have Sarah Hadland as a sort of, early Anglo Boadicea female warrior?
You've nailed
Maybe not
it.
Literally Boadicea, because you don't want to go too big on that. But, I mean, Sarah Hadland's, she kind of with Miranda, she plays on the fact that she's tiny little thing.
Yeah.
But could you be a tiny little angry warrior type?
You have absolutely trumped my my thoughts there. That is brilliant. That not only have you got a great character, but you've cast it as well. That's fabulous. Well, I hope our listeners have enjoyed our little tour through history. I think we were funny at times, but I hope it was entertaining and educational. And we'll be back with a proper series, as Alan has just completely blown the gaff. We are doing Are You Being Served next. So we're currently working on that. That will be with you in the next few weeks.
Nice one. Thank you for all your research, Gareth.
That's a pleasure. And thank you. Let's just remind our listeners that they can follow us on Facebook at the British Sitcom History Podcast or on Instagram at BritcomPod. So let us know what you thought of the episode, and we will see you all soon. Bye.
Bye.